Why is California so expensive and states like Texas and Florida are much more affordable? You look at Austin, Texas. A lot of people were moving to Texas for a variety of reasons, and there was a big run-up in prices. And unlike a San Francisco or a Los Angeles, the city built a lot of new housing, and now what you're seeing are rents falling back down. And now the crisis is, oh, rents are falling too quickly. To my mind, that would be a great problem for California to have.
And I might disagree a bit is that, first off, we have a barrier to entry right in Southern California, which is basically the mountains and the ocean. We're sitting in, like, especially in Southern California, up in the Bay Area too, this is the 1% of the 1% of the 1%. Do we go in there and say, let's go build a 7-story, bring in 1,000 apartments here and there? I think that's where the problem is. The word affordable housing, I guess, is kind of an unusual word in that it's not really affordable. It's just all subsidized. Just because you want to be here doesn't mean we should find some way to subsidize to have you here.
This can be a contentious policy space, but I'm looking forward to a constructive dialogue. I think there's wide agreement that we have a housing shortage, and there's a lot of different ways of closing it.
Hopefully what the audience would learn is what the different distinctions are. I think a lot of times when people talk about affordable housing or housing, it's a very complicated subject. It's a good opportunity to get people that might have different points of view of how they'd solve the same problem.
Jim, it's great to have you on. Welcome.
Great to be here.
Nolan, it's great to have you on. Welcome.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
We want to talk to you about housing. California has initiatives to build housing. We want to build 2.5 million homes. And at the same time, we have a big affordability crisis here. We have been building 80,000 homes a year in the last few years. The goal is to build 500,000 homes. Jim, let's start with you. Do you think this is possible?
I don't think it's possible with how we're set up to do it now. If you look at large developments, large projects that would be put out there, to get through the whole environmental process is pretty much impossible now. What the state legislatures has done is they've come back and they said, well, we're working on all these deals. What the deals basically are is you go to do your project, and in California, anybody can sue you to stop the project. And so you've got a situation where the labor unions will come in and file suit against the development saying it has some environmental issues, when all they're really looking for is what's called a project labor agreement, a contract to take control and have all union members build projects. The problem that we've had in California is this would always stop projects, and the legislature came back and they said, we figured a great way to solve this problem. We'll just make sure that everything's union labor, and then we'll allow you to build your project and you don't have to have an environmental impact report. So the problem is it's not like people don't know how to put 2x4s and concrete together. We know how to do that. It's not like we don't have the land throughout the state of California. We have that. Everybody wants to get their piece of the pie, and that's what stops development from moving forward.
Now, Nolan, do you think this goal is possible?
I absolutely agree. We have to do something about environmental review in California. It's a huge source of entitlement delays. I think it's a multifaceted issue. I mean, first, we have to have local zoning rules that actually allow housing to be built. If it's altogether illegal to build housing, the environmental review doesn't really matter all that much. If it takes 2 years to get entitlements and permits to actually start building, you're not going to have a lot of projects, especially smaller projects where your local builders, they're not going to have attorneys on staff to navigate that process. And then we have to get the cost down. California is one of the most expensive states to build in. Even when you get the zoning and the permits all lined up, there's a lot of reasons for this, not the least of which are incredibly high impact fees. In some jurisdictions in California, you can't even start building until you pay a $100,000 per unit parks fee. This cocktail of restrictions on development have made it impossible to build in California. So I agree. The current framework we're operating within, we're never going to be able to build the housing that our state needs.
Now, one of the goals that the state has is more density. They are proposing to put these housing and get the cities closer communities to oceans, like places that are already built, to have more housing. What are your thoughts on that, Jim?
Well, that's probably where Noah and I might disagree a bit, is that first off, what the state has done is we do these things called these RHNA numbers, Regional Housing Need Numbers. And basically, whenever you have a 4-letter acronym agency in a government, you got to be worried. But basically, you have people deciding where the population is going to grow in California. Not where it's going to grow on its own, but they're going to force it to grow a certain way. So then what they do is, when I was the mayor of Costa Mesa, they would do our numbers and say, how many affordable housing units did we have to have available to be built based on zoning? And we needed like 3 units. It was like nothing, no problem whatsoever. And I was very positive about getting development done in the town and moving things forward. But when they come back and the next year they say, well, you need 4,000, or they go to Huntington Beach and say you need 11,000 or 13,000, that's where the problems start to have, because what you're doing is I do large scale development in Colorado, and I'm there, when there was the farm. And so I got to tell you, future planning for left-hand turn pockets and how big your sewer lines have to be and all those kind of things have to be done way in advance, and they're not done yet. So from an infrastructure standpoint, Costa Mesa approved 1,000 apartments on 10 acres right on the freeway. Has one road to get to Harbor Boulevard. It's all backed up. We're just not built for it to do it. And so to have a government agency just come in there and say, these are the numbers, you have to hit it, tough luck, when the reality of it is people move to the Inland Empire because that's where there's housing, that's where there's more affordable housing. And we have this thing here saying, well, everybody just wants to be down at the beach. Well, so do I. But it's expensive to be down at the beach, and just because you want to be here doesn't mean we can somehow find that unit for you. How you find that unit is the marketplace. The marketplace will set prices of what it's going to be at. You get into a big problem when government, the word affordable housing, I guess, is kind of an unusual word in that it's not really affordable. It's just all subsidized, because a 2x4s cost the same, concrete costs the same, the apartments are the same, but it's who's going to subsidize it to push the rent down. And that's really the problem that we have, is trying to subsidize brand new expensive units.
Now, Nolan, what are your thoughts on density of the cities having to zone to build more? And do you think that will bring the housing cost down?
Stepping back at the 10,000 foot level here, why is California so expensive and states like Texas and Florida are much more affordable? It's because in those states, they allow the market to actually work. And when supply increases, maybe in a particular city or in a particular neighborhood, developers can go in and bring that new housing online. That new supply reduces pressure on existing units, and you maintain affordability. That's true for the state of California as a whole. The state as a whole is just not building enough housing, but that's especially true in certain locations. Now, I agree. I think this Rube Goldbergian system of assigning permit numbers that jurisdictions need to plan for, it's not how I would design the system. I would prefer to say, hey, there's some general affordability target. If you're not in the universe of actually maintaining affordability, certain interventions will take place. I think part of the challenge for this issue is that there are certain very high demand parts of the state that build almost no housing. And so much of the housing production ends up going into the handful of places, mostly in the interior of the state, that still allow some housing to be built. So I agree. I don't necessarily think the solution here is for the government to come in and say this housing needs to be built here or there. But the solution should be, how do we remove the regulatory barriers in the highest demand places? For example, where I am in West LA, it's an enormous job center. A lot of people want to live there. There's enormous housing demand, but it's the part of the city that's probably building the least housing. And that's not because there's not demand. There's tons of demand. We simply don't allow the market to meet that demand. And so to my mind, I wouldn't say we need density here or there. This is going to be revealed by if you let developers build the housing that consumers want.
So do you think if they were to build in these areas that there's demand, do you think the cost of housing will go down?
Yeah, I think that one of the most robust findings we have from urban economics is that when you build more housing in particular places, overall prices go down. So we know that when you build more housing, and for example, there's been studies of this in various cities all across the country. We know that when new supply is being built in a particular neighborhood or a particular city, prices in that immediate vicinity go down for rents, for example. Now, for the average homeowner in California, it's not going to affect them because most of the value of a home in California is tied up with the land. And so new development will actually increase the value of that. But yes, this is relatively clear that, we have examples of this in other cities, right? You look at Austin, Texas. Over the course of COVID, there was an enormous run-up in demand in Austin as a lot of people were moving to Texas for a variety of reasons. And there was a big run-up in prices. But in Austin, unlike a San Francisco or a Los Angeles, the city built a lot of new housing. And now what you're seeing are rents falling back down, coming back down to planet Earth. And now the crisis is, rents are falling too quickly. To my mind, that would be a great problem for California to have.
Jim, do you think the housing costs will go down if we have a lot of development in these cities, the coastal cities?
Well, I mean, I think in the end, you're very correct in what you're saying, is that more roofs is more roofs. When I was on the chairman of the Housing Commission, my whole thing always was, we just need more roofs, meaning more units out there. If you can get more units out there, that'll bring down your costs. The question is, how do you do that? And so depending on how you're subsidizing it, or who has to pay for the subsidy, or where does it come from? If you go to, say, a middle-class community in the middle of Orange County, in Santa Ana, Garden Grove, Westminster, and you go in there and you say, we're going to go ahead and have a fee on every developer per foot to go towards affordable housing, it's like you got middle America subsidizing middle America. This makes no sense. I'm going to pay $10 more a foot to do it. When you're along the coast or some more expensive areas that have quote unquote a brand, they have brand value, they can get away with saying, oh, 20,000 more unit or 30,000 more unit, a fee we can pay. They can get away with that because what they're building is so valuable down by the beach or whatever. So there's just these different ways of how do you pay for it. The other thing that comes in is we do get to a point of saying, just because you want to be here doesn't mean we should find some way to subsidize to have you here. Now that's not, when I brought this up years ago, I got pillared by, Righeimer says, get out. I didn't say that, but there are people every day that get in a car, drive to the Inland Empire so they can find housing that has a good school and their kids can go to, and they put up with that commute, which is not fun, but they do it to get the housing. We're sitting in, especially in Southern California, up in the Bay Area too, this is the 1% of the 1% of the 1%. The biggest problem we have with these costs is we have so many people from around the world just coming here and just buying a house and moving in. All of my peers, all their kids feel like losers. They got college degrees and everything else. They can't buy a house. It's not here. So we have to figure out some way to bring it down. But do we go in there and say, let's go build a 7-story, like they do in Costa Mesa, 1,000 units, 7 stories? It doesn't fit with anything that's there or around there. Is there other ways to get other projects that have lower densities approved sooner and quicker? Yeah. Is it bringing 1,000 apartments here and there? I think that's where the problem is, or where.
So do you think if that 1,000 apartment comes into Costa Mesa,
right,
do you think that will lower the housing cost?
If you have more units, it'll lower the housing cost. Now understand, none of these are quote unquote affordable units. They're all expensive units. But a person who lives in that unit moves from somewhere. We've all lived, most of us have all lived in affordable housing. It was called that 50-year-old house that we rented with 2 roommates. That's how you handle affordable housing. The thing that drives me crazy is sit there and saying, we need to build affordable housing. The most expensive housing is brand new. It's not depreciated, it's not older, it's brand new. So in Costa Mesa, we just finished up, I'm saying the city, did a motel, which is basically studio apartments, right? At $600,000 a piece. They rehabbed an old building at $600,000 a piece. That's just too much money. That's a massive amount of money that I say, and the federal government is coming in with money, and the state's coming in with money. People are going to start going to jail. There's too much money here. When you push much money around with politicians and everything else, problems happen. And so, yes, does more units bring down rents? Yes, it will. But there's also a point where there's so many people that want to be here, that's what forces the rents up. Just because I grew up here, I've always been here, you should give me an apartment or a unit that I can afford. It's like, I'd like that too. But look where you're living. When I talk to young folks, like I said, I do a lot of work in Colorado. In Colorado, 24-year-olds buy houses. They put 3% down. They buy a house for $450, they buy a used house for $275. They buy a new one for $400. They live a normal life. Southern California, the Bay Area, the costs are so ridiculously high because people want to be here. That's what's pushing it up. And I don't know if there's really a way to solve that.
Now, what is your concern if a city like Costa Mesa builds a lot of these 1,000 unit apartments?
Well, first of all, it changes the traffic patterns if you can make things move. When we were there, we worked extremely hard in getting what's for A, B, C, D, E, F intersections. We worked very hard in getting our F intersections moved up to a better intersection. And that meant, widening roads, getting double left-hand pockets in, just really kind of, pounding it out intersection to intersection. In a new development, you plan all that stuff ahead of time. We didn't plan it in the 50s, in the 60s, in most areas. So it's just hard to do it. I mean, literally, the sewer pipes, there's a reason why there's a 6-inch pipe, an 8-inch pipe, a 12-inch pipe. You put 1,000 units, all of a sudden it's like, well, you only have an 8-inch pipe there. How are you going to do it? An 8-inch pipe goes for, 5 miles or whatever, 3 miles. You just can't change that out. So a lot of times those things mechanically don't work. That's the problem with it. And I'm not even talking about it changes the culture of the community and all that kind of stuff. I'll leave that to the side. I'm just saying from a mechanical standpoint, traffic, impacts, and that kind of stuff.
Now, Nolan, you mentioned your community needs to build housing. The demand is there, but the housing is not there. And you're hearing Jim is saying, we can't have those kinds of housing there because we don't have the infrastructure. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, he's raising a totally valid concern. I would just say, look, growth is tough. It's not easy. You got to have a plan. You got to make sure that we have fiscal mechanisms for funding this. There are certain propositions on many local and state ballots this year to expand the ability for local governments to issue bonds for this infrastructure. Growth is tough, but the stagnation and decline that we're dealing with, I would argue, is even tougher. I mean, part of what's happening across California is populations are actually falling, right? People are leaving California because they're priced out. They're young people who are realizing I don't have a path to homeownership here, or they're retiring folks who are realizing the cost of living is just totally out of control. If we don't solve that problem, I think everything that has made California this place of opportunity for the country is going to go away. So absolutely, we have to be making provisions for infrastructure to scale up pipes and other sorts of transportation infrastructure that we need to accommodate new growth. But to say, well, we're going to solve that problem by simply not allowing housing, which I don't think Jim is saying, but sometimes folks do say that, is simply, to my mind, not an acceptable solution. Again, look at what they're doing in states that are maintaining affordability. They're saying this housing is going to be coming. We have 2 options. We can allow the housing. Really, we have 3 options. We can do nothing and just settle into a California-style housing crisis. We can let the housing get built, but without a comprehensive plan for scaling up the infrastructure, and that's going to lower the quality of life of people who already live there, and they're going to understandably be upset about that. Or we can sit down and say, what's the growth that's coming? What's the infrastructure that we need? How are we going to finance it in a way that's fair and allow it to happen?
Now, Jim, do you think it's possible to fix the infrastructure and build more?
On the edges, there is, but you're talking about massive dollars to do it. I mean, to go in and rip out sewer pipes and to go in and literally, buy buildings on corners. I'm not talking about gas stations. I'm talking about real buildings to widen roads, to get left-hand turn pockets and that kind of stuff in there is really problematic. I think it's not as easy as people think to go just, we'll just do it. Because the public doesn't know what's going on underground. My business, I deliver lots to home builders. So I put the streets, the roads, the school sites, the trails and that kind of stuff. We do it all, but it's today when we're designing it and getting it set. Plus, we don't have a barrier to entry with land. So he's absolutely right about Austin. Austin, the home builders are getting killed right now. The prices have come down dramatically because they overbuilt. There were just too many, and they allow it. Same thing happened with office buildings in Dallas. They just let them build them, and guess what? They get built, and all of a sudden there's too much office space. Well, that's the market to figure out. That tough luck. That's the way it is. On the way up, you make it. On the way down, you get hurt. That's fine. But they also have room to grow, to spread out. We don't have it here. We have a barrier to entry right in Southern California, which is basically the mountains and the ocean. And so our issue is more of people want to be here, and people are willing to pay a ridiculous amount. Now, I completely agree with, when I was looking at areas in our town that had dirty soil, because it was industrial, and it was a mess. They couldn't sell those warehouses. They couldn't trade them because they had environmental problems. And so when there was an overlay put in to allow housing land is worth more than industrial land. So it gives a lift. And all of a sudden, there's the $1 million to clean it up. And I would have tons of people come to the microphone and scream and yell, and you're ruining my neighborhood, and you're putting these 3-story townhomes with roof decks on them. I'm thinking, these are great. What are you talking about here? This was an industrial area. And the traffic impact balanced against what the existing traffic impact was. But this poor little developer is getting beat up by all these local issues. I mean, to go to the public and say, you don't understand, if we don't allow more housing to come in, the price of housing is going to go up. Homeowners are like, what's the problem with that? I own a home already. I'm fine with it going up. It doesn't matter to me. But we need to go ahead and give some kind of shorter term for people to go ahead and put a few dollars in and risk to get something entitled, to get it done. And the problem that I see, so if we're talking about those things, I think we're in total agreement. How do we get people to get stuff entitled and say, hey, you got 90 days to do this, you got 60 more days for this, and you move it forward? My thing is more when the state comes in and says, this is a statewide issue, therefore, charter cities, you have no control of your town anymore, and we're going to tell you how many units you have to bring in, and you must rezone property to allow for that higher density of units. And if you don't, we're going to do what's called a builder's remedy, where they get so many days and the builder they're approved. That's not good. So it unbalances it. And I don't think people who live in single family neighborhoods should all of a sudden sit there and go, wait, I got a bunch of apartments in my backyard now. They made a deal when they bought a house, a neighbor, they thought the way it was. Now it's like, oh, we need more people to be here, so we're going to put apartments in your neighborhood.
If you like California Insider and you like to know what's going on in California, make sure to check out Epoch Times. This is a newspaper that started by a group of Chinese Americans because of human rights abuses in China, and now is starting to grow here. Make sure to go to the Epoch Times website and check out the California section, where you can get a lot of fresh perspectives on what's going on in California. Now let's go back to the interview. Now, Nolan, do you think this is possible without those mandates from the state? Because there are the people in the community that don't want the housing, they don't want the development next to them. Or does it have to be that there needs to be a lot of development where those 1,000 unit apartments have to be built in different parts of the community in California, different cities?
Well, of course, my first preference is for local governments to come up with a plan to allow for a reasonable amount of housing and have the infrastructure planned for that we're going to need to actually accommodate growth. The problem is the local politics often don't line up around that, and we're in a bit of a prisoner's dilemma, right? So, I mean, just take Orange County. If Costa Mesa were to build a bunch of housing, but every single other jurisdiction in Orange County is not allowing any more housing, we might not fully realize the affordability benefits that we could have achieved if every local government was allowing at least a little bit more housing. So, that's, I think, one thing that the state can come in and do that's a little bit positive is to say, everybody needs to come up with a plan to allow at least a little bit more housing. And we can debate about how those allocations should be calculated and how they should be allocated, totally fair. But the problem is we need every local government to be building at least some housing. And in many cases, exactly as you're sort of pointing out, whenever a local elected official proposes, hey, let's do a rezoning, let's rezone a neighborhood, let's rezone our corridor to allow for townhouses or multifamily, the folks who show up at the public hearing in many cases are not representative of the broader community. They're not factoring in the regional impacts. And so you have to have some sort of regional or state coordination. I think there's another, the state can come in to scale up best practices, right? So one of the most successful interventions over the past 10 or so years has been statewide legalization of accessory dwelling units. In 2017, the state said every homeowner in the state of California has the right to add an additional home to his or her lot, maybe in an unused attic or basement or garage or in a new detached structure. Since 2017, this was an intervention that didn't cost the government any money. We've had about 110,000 ADUs permitted, 70,000 of which have been built. That's a sort of small-scale intervention that gets more housing built, doesn't solve the problem, it makes progress toward the problem, doesn't solve it, but it's a useful first step, and it sort of shows, hey, when we remove some of these extreme barriers to housing production, we do get more housing units built. And in the case of ADUs, I think it shows that there's actually a lot of potential for infill that doesn't necessarily dramatically disrupt the character of communities in a way that upsets people. We can have small-scale additional housing being built, backyard cottages, lot splits, townhouses in existing neighborhoods, and then mid-rise multifamily along commercial corridors, in many cases where we have strip malls or office buildings that are sitting half empty. We can have housing get built in those places that actually enriches the community quality of life and deals with the housing issue. But in many cases, just given the way that local politics around housing are in California, those interventions are going to have to come from the state.
Now, what are your thoughts on those type of developments, Jim?
Well, I think when you're along the corridors, where you are changing out, the whole model of retail has changed dramatically. I mean, you're still going to buy the toothpaste. You're just not going to buy it at the grocery store. It's going to come shipped to your house. It's like every day at my house, stuff is just shipped. It's just how it is. I mean, so you don't need the actual retail space. You need these massive warehouses. And if you've seen some of these things, they're 5-6 stories tall, open to the ceiling, open all the way up, and they have, amazing logistics to go ahead and do all this stuff. So it's changing it. So then you're going to find vacant properties along corridors, and that you have to look at, because usually it's backed up by maybe housing, but it's farther back in there. When you get into the ADUs, I really still have an issue with it, because what happens to a lot of the neighborhoods, a couple of things. First off, if you just look from a mechanical standpoint of where does everybody park. So in my community, average lot's 50-foot wide, maybe 55-foot wide. You put a 20-foot wide driveway in there. You've got 30 feet left. You maybe can get 2 cars on the street. You have a place to park in the driveway and maybe in the garage. You go ahead and you add a unit in the back. Now all of a sudden you have to have 1 or 2 more cars. What they realized, and what we realized right from the beginning, was we approved to have some ADUs, but we said you have to handle the parking, because that's the externality. That's the issue to everybody else that you're putting off on somebody, which is there's no place to park. And what the state realized, they were doing that. Well, fine, we'll get rid of the parking requirements. So now here's what we have. In my neighborhood, it's not really much of a problem. Nicer, bigger homes. Nobody wants an apartment in their backyard. We get a few, we're here and there. But what you'd call the middle class people with their 1965, 1,480 square foot home, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, double car garage, those, no matter what they say about who can do them, are literally being bought by developers. And they'll go ahead and they'll put an apartment in. If I was in my 30s, back when I'd be doing it. It's like, what? I put an apartment in the back. It gives a major lift to value. It's fine. But what are the impacts to the neighborhood? And the impacts to the neighborhood are 2 more cars out in front, and there's really no place to put them. So I can take you to different neighborhoods of the 1960 neighborhoods in Orange County, and you drive down them and you say, there really isn't any parking here anymore. So number one, it causes an impact to people in the community, because you've got more cars that have to be in there. Then you've got a situation where the state said, hey, if you illegally converted your garage to an apartment, we'll kind of check through the fire codes now, but we'll let you go ahead and keep that apartment. Well, what about the 2 parking spaces that we count in the parking count that you need for a community? You need 2 spaces there, you need 1 space for a guest, whatever. Again, as a developers, I could argue that maybe some of those restrictions are too high, but at some point you need parking. And so what'll happen is they won't have enough of parking. The next thing that happens, nobody understands. If you add more ADUs, more units in general, will rents go down? Yeah, because you have more units. Not necessarily those rents, though. Those are pretty good rents. You live in a nice community, you get good rent for that brand new unit that was put in someone's backyard. Those rents will go down. But you lose home ownership, because those properties that basically were there for a homeowner to buy, a first-time homeowner to buy from the next person, are now investor properties because they have an apartment in back. And I know to the rest of the country, this may sound like crazy numbers, but a starter home would be $650,000, $700,000, quote unquote, in Orange County, and now you're paying $1 million, $1 million, $2 million. So the first-time home buyers totally get wiped out once it gets converted to an apartment, and that's just problematic. I know the next issue that comes in, well, let's go subdivide them all up. I didn't want to go down the road of subdividing up. There are thousands of pages of how we handle condominiums and everything else, for all the rules and everything else. To have 1 or 2 people start dividing up lots and easements and all sorts of issues, you don't even want to go down that road. It's just too much of a mess. So the ADU unit, when the state comes in and says, don't worry about the impacts. When they first said you could do them, I wasn't thrilled about it. But once they said, hey, don't worry about the impact, you don't have to have any parking. Or if you're close enough to a bus route, and if you're close enough to Harbor Boulevard, let's say, you don't have to have any parking when you bring your extra unit in. Well, buses don't go anywhere. They go up and down. No one's going to the grocery store on a bus. You're not in Orange County because how we were laid out. If we were laid out differently, it'd be one thing, but we're laid out in 1 mile squares. And so you got a mile this way and a mile that way. People aren't waiting for buses to get to the grocery store or whatever they're going to do. We're not set up for those. So that's my biggest concern. We're not set up, and we're getting rid of first-time home buyer housing. Now becomes, investor housing.
What are your thoughts on that, Nolan? That this, even though it might help with some rent issues, it will increase the cost of housing because investors come in, and then also the parking issues.
Sure, we'll work in reverse here. So on parking, the data I've seen suggests most ADUs have off-street parking, simply because if they're going to be rented out in Southern California, for example, you're going to have off-street parking to attract a tenant. In cases where the ADU does not have off-street parking, in many cases the tenant actually doesn't own a car, might be an older family member or a young adult child, or they share a car with somebody in the primary structure. And that's not to say that there are no cases where an ADU is built for a household that has a car that doesn't have off-street parking. But to my mind, again, this is where our paradigm is really important. Do we think, hey, the new housing is going to cause a problem, let's block it or impose a costly mandate on it? Or do we think, let's allow the new housing and come up with a way of mitigating the impact? So in the case of an ADU, where you have a tenant that has a car but no parking space, to my mind, the way to resolve that problem is to have residential on-street parking permits for the homeowners to make sure that they're protected. They still have the parking space that they believe they had when they bought the home, while the unit can still be built. And if a homeowner says, oh, okay, geez, I can't rent this ADU out unless I provide off-street parking or pay some sort of fee to get a residential parking permit, they won't build it, right? And so this is, again, we need to think of mitigating the impacts rather than unilaterally saying, no, this housing is going to cause an impact, we can't allow it. To the homeownership piece, I think this is really important, and I feel it acutely as somebody who would like to be a California homeowner someday. To my mind, the real thing that's wiped out homeownership in California is simply we're not building starter homes at scale. And when I say starter homes to certainly a lot of older elected officials, I think they still think of that single-family, 2-car garage on a 5,000 to 7,500 square foot lot, right? A starter home in California in 2024, you ask any real estate professional this, it's going to be a townhouse, it's going to be maybe a 2 or 3 bedroom condo, it's going to be a small lot home, maybe a home on a 2,500, 1,400 square foot lot. And those are precisely the types of housing that are illegal to build in the case of LA in about 75% of the city, in your typical suburb, probably about 100% of residential areas. So exactly to a point you were raising earlier, California, especially coastal California, is unique in that we're hemmed in by the beaches and the mountains. If we're going to restore homeownership, it's going to have to involve some sort of infill, and it's going to have to involve things like townhouses and affordable condos. And as long as it's illegal to build those in the vast majority of coastal California, we're never going to get on track to affordability, and hundreds of thousands of people are going to have to keep moving to places like Nevada and Arizona and essentially exporting the California housing crisis.
Before we continue, we would like to thank Shenyun for sponsoring this channel. I lived in China for 2 years and experienced 2 different Chinas. One is the China we know now, unfortunately with communism. And the other is ancient Chinese culture with 5,000 years of history, strong values, ethics and morality that has been lost. Shenyun Performing Arts is reviving this 5,000 years of Chinese traditional culture. It takes you back in time to magical world of ancient China with a unique blend of brilliant dancing, beautiful costumes, and legends coming to life. Go to shenyun.com to find out the schedule and theater information. It's a lifetime experience you don't want to miss.
Just so inspiring. It makes me want to go dance.
Breathtaking. I was very impressed.
I'm taking my program and I'm going to mention it on the news because I think it's a great performance and people should see it.
What I loved about the show was the authenticity of it. It was taking me on a journey.
Exceptional. The technique involved, that the thousands of hours of training.
People just float. Everything was exact, and then they worked to the exact moment, and it was beautiful.
You go away feeling with a smile in your heart from it.
Have to come. Life-changing.
Make sure you see it. Make sure you see it.
Don't wait. Get your tickets now.
Now, Jim, what do you think of the affordability issues? So your thoughts are we shouldn't be building those ADUs. And we built some, but I don't know how many is left to build. Is there a lot more left?
Oh, no, No, they haven't even touched it. I mean, if people started doing them, there'd be millions of them because there's millions of single-family houses, so there would be in there. And I think the impacts would start to come in. I think from a political standpoint, once neighborhoods get affected by it for the parking and the driving and the, all being packed in and not fitting to what they thought, politics will change. The problem is they're already built, and that's going to be 10 or 15 years from now. It takes time. We look at all these propositions that we have on the ballot, solving propositions from 10 years ago. It's just what happens. It takes time for the public to kind of get in it. So again, I don't have a problem with getting more units. I don't have a problem with looking at corridors and those types of things. I do have a problem when there is no single-family housing at all, zoning, I guess you would call it now, in California. To the point where, I've seen developers, and again, these are brand new units, so when they're brand new, I can't complain. But developers will have a 50-unit single-family project, and they'll put it back in to a 100-unit project. They'll basically put an apartment with every single house and do it, and I've seen it. Now, I argue less with that because it's brand new and everybody knows what they're buying into. But every single house has an extra apartment that comes with it. It's blended into the community. It's figured out. And they always park it. They just do because they know they can't sell it. And I'm not saying it's every community is that way, but in most suburban communities, people want to have a parking space.
Now, do you think somebody that buys a single-family home with that zoning, do you think they're entitled to that forever?
If you ask me, does a person have the right to have that single family forever? At a certain point, you do have major depreciation in properties. They do get older. You'll see it in older communities. I'm just thinking of communities that were in the early 1900s, up and down the coast, the Long Beaches of the world and all that, with the single family house in front. And then, as that stuff deteriorated, nobody's going to tear down a house to put a single family house in. And so, then it did get upzoned for like a 4 units could go on it. And the elected officials voted for that to have that. But that's over a long time. So it's really not a matter of should they have it forever. No, I can't guarantee it forever because the rules are, it's like when someone says, when we came here, that was never here. Right, well, or it was zoned something else. Right, I understand that. But the rules say they can change the zoning. And that's what elected officials should do. So how they get there is hard because, people like to fight these things. But as communities get older, depreciated, and if they're not taken care of, zoning can change.
So what are your thoughts on zoning? Do you think that we should eliminate the single-family zoning, which essentially some people argue that with all these laws, to some level, we're eliminating the single-family zoning?
To my mind, we have a housing crisis in California because the government dramatically abridges the property rights of homeowners and anybody who owns property to build housing on the land they own. What should our rules and regulations be focused on? To my mind, they should be focused on activities that have a real nuisance impact on neighbors, right? And historically, that's what actual planning was about. That's what land use regulation did. If you're going to engage in some behavior that's going to cause a bunch of noise or smoke or any sort of stormwater runoff or generating an extreme amount of traffic, we're going to regulate that, but we're not going to necessarily say to every homeowner, you can't take your unused attic or unused basement or a portion of your backyard and turn it into an extra rental unit. In many cases, to house, again, friends and family. To my mind, part of how we get ourselves out of this crisis is to allow folks to use their property the way they would like, again, as long as they're not hurting others. Historically, this was very common, right? I mean, we're talking about it in abstract terms. You go to many pre-zoning neighborhoods in California, for example, and certainly across the country, and what do you see? You see a mixture of housing typologies. Maybe that neighborhood was initially built out as all single-family homes, but over time, as demand increases, one of the homes turned into a few townhouses. One of the homes turned into a small multifamily building. And to the extent we still have these neighborhoods, in many cases, they're some of the most desirable neighborhoods in our country, having things like corner groceries that also are completely illegal to build today. To the extent we still have neighborhoods like this, we subject them to preservation requirements, right? That mean that you can't actually ever redevelop them. But then we turn around and say, oh, by the way, you can never build a neighborhood like that ever again. I don't think that the bulk of California's housing production is going to come from any sort of changes to rules in single-family neighborhoods. I think in the near future, the most housing production is going to come from building a lot more housing near transit, on commercial corridors, near job centers. But to my mind, I would say we need an all of the above set of solutions here. We have a debilitating housing crisis, and if certain homeowners want to add additional units to their lot, or if small local developers want to buy a home and add multiple units to that, to my mind, that's the market working, and we should let it work.
So how do we solve this affordability crisis? Do we allow your friends' kids and people that live in your area should we just tell them that there's no other option for you, you have to move to other areas, and then maybe move back to these cities? Or should we build high-rises in the thousands and invest in the infrastructure and change kind of what you guys bought into or that community bought into?
I mean, you got a lot of questions there and a lot of different ways to put it. I think overall, when you have the demand people have who will pay whatever they'll overpay because they can afford it, houses in an area, they'll push up prices. And as long as more people want to be there than you have housing units for, you're clearly going to have prices continue to go up. I believe if there more units are built in different areas that can fit it, fine. It was funny, when I ran for office, I was, somebody who was a developer, and I just wanted all sorts of development. Listen, for developers, I'll work with you. I'll help you figure out what we have to do. I'll get you there. But the reality of it is, we can't just go ahead and think we're going to somehow put 1,000-unit apartment complexes. We looked at industrial areas, and we put in a couple acres. We were put in 16, 20 units per acre, something like that, and that would work. That would fit. But to turn around and come back and say 100 units per acre, that's just a massive change to the area. So is there something in an existing town that's 90% built out that can be changed? Rezone industrial areas that you don't need anymore. Look at corridors as properties, shut down because they're not being rented out as Ace Hardware anymore because they're just not. Shift those, fine. But when the state comes in with a heavy hand and just says, listen, you are going to go ahead and find this somehow to do it, and if you don't do it, we're going to find it for you. That makes no sense. No, we're not going to have a unit for everybody who wants to live here. It's not going to be a place for you. So what I've said to people before is you should move to an area where you and your family can live in a good house, a nice place, your kids can go to a good school. And that may not be at the beach. And you just got to say that. And I know it sounds like it's cruel and unfair and people want to live by. I know they do. But everybody coming here just forces up prices to a point where it makes no sense. In my neighborhood, the houses have gone crazy. I mean, it was 10 years ago, they were 600,000-700,000, and that was considered high. And then they're like $1 million, $1 million, $2 million, and then they're fixing them up. Now we've got people from LA coming down into Orange County going, we have to get out of LA for other reasons, for what's happened in LA. And these 2,000 square foot houses are selling for $2.5–3 million. The problem is people aren't putting their houses on the market. That's why the prices have gone crazy. I think we're going to have a major drop, especially these $2 and $3 million tract homes that are 30 years old, even though they're fixed up. I think we're going to have a major drop in price because there's just nothing available. So you want to get out of LA. You've got issues in your neighborhood. You come down to Orange County and you got the money, so you just pay it because there's nothing available. People don't want to give up their 3% mortgages. Once rates come down a bit, a lot of stuff's going to come on. I think we'll see some downward pressure, but having a $3 million house go down to 2.6 that's not helping. Get housing. I understand that, but again, I don't know how government's going to go ahead and somehow subsidize your living so you can live in this community.
So do you think when you build those 1,000 units, apartment units, you're actually still competing with all the global and different people that want to come?
Look at the issue that we've had here with the non-documented workers, or whatever we call them now, coming into the country. Whether it's 2 million, 4 million, or 10 million, they have to live somewhere. Okay, they're going to live somewhere, and so they're going to take up units. And no matter where on the level they move into, they're going to overcrowd it or bring more people in, or even if it's not overcrowded, they're going to pay more because they're going to compete. It's like whenever a minimum wage goes up in an area that has no housing, who do you think ends up at 80% of that money? The landlord. because you just bid as high as you can afford just because you need to live there. And so the costs continue to go up, and you have people coming into the country, and then we wonder why rents are going up. If you didn't have all those people coming in, rents wouldn't go up as much and you have less impact. Now, is that going to change Southern California? Somewhat. I mean, on the margins, it always changes it. But you have so many people that want to live here in California, it just forces the price up.
Now, Nolan, some final thoughts. You heard Jim's concern about building these big buildings where we have 1,000 units, but you probably disagree. Can you tell us your thoughts on those?
Look, we have a good problem, right? California has a fairly strong economy. We have a lot of healthy industries. Obviously, we're blessed with, here in Southern California, perfect year-round weather, mountains, beaches. A lot of people want to live here. They're always going to want to live here. We have two possible ways of responding to that. We can say, well, sorry, we're full. And what's going to happen in this scenario is hundreds of thousands of middle-class Californians are going to continue to flood out of the state. We're going to gut our middle class, and the politics are going to get even more toxic here. Or we can say, okay, let's come up with a plan to actually build the housing that our state needs. Now, I agree that this is often a big challenge for local elected officials, given the politics that they face. But, right, think about the Odyssey, right? What does Odysseus do when he's about to sail by the sirens, when he knows he's going to misbehave? He ties himself to the mast. This is, I think, what these state interventions can do, is they can say, hey, local elected officials, your choice is not between are you going to build the housing our state needs or are you not going to build it, but the choice is how we're going to build it and what's the plan for building it. Again, a lot of kinks to iron out in the current process, but that has to be the frame, that we have a housing shortage and we have to backfill it. I would say, too, this is not impossible. California did this before the 60s, 70s, 80s, when so many of these environmental mandates came online, when zoning got much more restrictive, when we decided that the coastal zone was going to be altogether off limits to any more housing development. California was once the sort of place that attracted the middle class, and we did that because we built lots and lots of housing, and it was an affordable state where you could come, get a good job, and find an apartment or a single-family home or a townhouse that met your needs. To my mind, we have a proof of this. Let's get back to doing that, and let's restore the California dream.
Jim Righeimer, former mayor of Costa Mesa. It was great to have you on California Insider. Nolan Gray, legislative analyst with YIMBY, California YIMBY. It was great to have you on California Insider. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Yeah, I think he raises valid concerns, which is that if you're going to build a lot more housing, you have to have a plan to scale up the infrastructure. And it's totally fair, right? That's tough, and that takes a lot of planning. I thought it was a great conversation. I mean, I think we agree that there's a significant housing shortage, and really the debate is over what to do about it. And so, to my mind, that's a healthy place for the debate to be. And hopefully the audience found some value in us getting into the weeds and wasn't scared off by, complicated issues like parking.
I thought it was good that two sides can look at the same problem. I learned through this discussion that there's a lot of things that we actually do agree about how to solve some of the housing problems. Several of the key takeaways that I did get from it was that there is a want from people out there, instead of saying NIMBY, not in my backyard, there are people out there that say, yes, we'll put housing in our backyard because we think for the community it's needed. Again, it's a balancing issue. I think that people that watch this will start to see that this is a much more complicated issue than just building some houses in a neighborhood or putting a bunch of granny flats in existing neighborhoods. It's a lot more complicated than that. And I think if the public starts to understand that, it can help solve the housing issue. But I don't know that we'll ever get to solve the housing issue when people just want to live in Southern California.